is our colleague from Western Sydney University, Dr. Milad Milani. So Milad will be talking about his forthcoming book, which is really exciting. And I think the topic of this talk is simply the title of his book as well, if I understand correctly. The Nature of Sufism, an ontological reading of the mystical in Islam, will be the title of his talk. So he will be talking today for around 30 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes for Q&A sessions and simply reflections. Once again, entirely informal, feel free to jump in and to join and make your contribution after his talk. In terms of Milad, so he is a really prolific author. So he has already written 3 books on this topic. So his first book was titled Sufism in the Secret History of Persia. His second book was titled Sufi Political Thought. And I think just a couple of months ago, maybe weeks ago, his third book was published. So it is a co-edited volume with Vasilis Hadratas. And the title of the book was Islam, Civility, and Political Culture. And I haven't read the last 2 books yet. I will be looking forward to reading them. But I'm much more excited about hearing about his next book, the ontological reading of Sufism and the nature of Sufism. So yeah, without further ado, Milad, the floor is yours. I will be muting everyone else just to make sure that there isn't any voice pollution. But once this talk is over, I will unmute everybody so that we can make comments and ask questions.
In terms of my thinking and my thinking processes since the time of my first book. However, there are some consistencies, and this has always been about the exploration of trying to get to the bottom of things and working through problems that I encounter as they arise. So a little caveat, what I'm going to talk about today already takes for granted a lot of background knowledge on a major philosophical figure, continental philosophical figure by the name of Heidegger, whom I use in the book as a theoretical framework, whose work I use as a theoretical framework, but also a lot of other, 2 other continental philosophers whom I'll just mention, but I won't be going into them or mentioning them at all in what I'm going to present today, and that is Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, and Friedrich Nietzsche. So these 3 figures in particular have been quite influential in recent developments, but they have been with me for a long time and in the background. So in the present time, I'm doing a lot of rethinking of things that I've been working on, Sufism in particular, and conducting some experimentations, thought experiments, with how to utilize and think through problems using these figures and their works. Obviously, it would be a pointless enterprise if I were to just mimic them or repeat them or regurgitate them. So by experimentation, I do mean that I am trying to think how to utilize them best to think through problems. So without further ado, I'll just start. I've got a script, so I'll just read it. There's a draft I've put together, so it's rough around the edges. I hope you'll forgive me, and I apologize if it comes across as, and in any way, insulting to anybody. But here it is. So as I said, given that the book is yet to be published, I thought I would offer a broad overview of some of the thinking behind the book and the kinds of issues and problems that inspired me to write the book. These being the same issues and problems that the book in large part deals with. But there will be a lot more about the book that I will not be speaking about today, and will leave for you to discover upon reading it in due course. This talk, therefore, will serve both as a teaser for the coming publication and offer something by way of a standalone piece on thinking about Sufism. The Nature of Sufism, the title of the forthcoming book, subtitled An Ontological Reading of the Mystical in Islam, consists of my recent study of Sufism that draws on Heidegger's thinking. From the outset, I take Sufism as a problem, or if you like, a puzzle to be solved, in the attempt to observe the phenomenon as much as possible through primary source material and leaving aside as much as possible secondary source material. The first chapter in the book is therefore provocatively titled Introduction to Sufism. An introduction I put in quotation marks. Taking philosophy, and please keep in mind continental philosophy, taking philosophy to task on this problematization of Sufism seemed to me a fresh approach, but one that could not dispense with history. To me, doing history is about getting clear about something or coming into clarity about that thing. It is not about history for the sake of history or writing history or explaining a history. That is, the past as though we know it or even can or ever can in full or with any degree of certainty grasp something of it. The story of Sufism, so called, is one that has typically been told over and again, and yet we are still asking, what is Sufism? What is Sufism, the question, is a misleading question. I do not presume Sufism to have a nature or to consist of an essence in that classical scholastic sense as consisting of a conditio sine qua non. The book is called The Nature of Sufism, and whilst this too is misleading, it is not mistaken. I do say that what it is because of what it does, and what it does is what makes it appear as that thing. Sufism, therefore, if anything, is the thing that is seen as the event of what is happening when a Muslim experiences something profoundly different to the Islamic norm. Sufism, therefore, if anything, is both simultaneously anomalous and analogous. That is, it is phenomenologically an anomaly that can be comprehended and spoken about with respect to what it is shown to be. This is an important point because it emphasizes, but it does not take literally, the often perceived issue that is at stake, namely, that Sufism cannot be spoken about or defined. Hence, we all know the well-known adage, Sufism was once a reality without a name, and it is now a name without a reality. Now I say emphasize but not take literally because the so-called issue and the accompanying adage that I just quoted is correctly perceived, but it is one that has no truth to it. That is, it does not offer any significant insight on its own. The point of the phrase is trivialized as a mystifying technique, to be sure. It is, however, a clue to the problem of missing the point about Sufism as what I argue to be a work of art working. And this is a direct borrowing of Heidegger's The Origin of Work of Art. This means it has no value in what the quote singly presents. That is, it is not representative of anything per se. But if understood in terms of what was once held up to Muslims as the culture of Sufism in the time of its prominence, it shows us what it is when Sufism is working as a work of art. As such, and by extension, it seems to us that Sufism changes and has changed, and that there are variations of it at any given time. But there are only varieties of experience constituted by disparities of habitus that are at play. It is therefore the question of being, and I emphasize being, within the context of the Islamicate world that requires our attention. I make this point with some degree of force to distinguish not authentic from inauthentic Sufism, which would be an arbitrary point, but rather authentic from inauthentic, quote, Sufi Dasein, end quote. A phrase which I introduce and which in the book, and which plays a key role in the book in the process of thinking about Sufism. It is intended to raise the underlying question of being as relevant to Sufism so as to ask what we might mean by being Sufi. As you may have gathered, the point about nature is one of a question of ontology and not metaphysics. Here I am directly referring to and drawing on Heidegger's point about the ontological difference, which is what he defined as the phenomenological problem of forgetting the question, what makes something intelligible, and instead assuming a metaphysical conclusion about the state of its being. It is therefore the meaning of being Sufi that has been forgotten, I argue, amidst the search for a history of Sufism. I scrutinize the metaphysical in Sufism because its definitional and historical references are normally explored by taking metaphysics as a given, but more importantly because it is precisely from the metaphysical that certain Sufis of the past were trying to break free. So I underline the taken-for-grantedness of scholarly framework through which the metaphysical view predominates the general mode of thinking about the Islamic and Sufi past. For instance, Sufism as a category of mysticism within Islam is the most common historical, traditional conceptualization which typically frames Sufism as Islamic mysticism. Of course, Sufism as a category is empty. The void is usually filled in by the ingenuity of historical agents. So, Junaid weaved the metaphysical into Sufism, becoming the first formidable articulator of the experiences of that great obscure mystic Bayezid. His, that is Junaid's, was a provocation laden so thick with gibberish that detractors could hardly discern a legal point of response. A good degree of historical and conceptual imaginary about Sufism was soon added in the synthesis of Al-Ghazali, that still makes it difficult for anyone wishing to determine with any certainty where the line between Sufism and Islam is drawn. The line itself, Sarab. Al-Ghazali gave, one might also provocatively say false, certitude to the notion that Sufism is Islamic mysticism, denoting that experience is itself evidence of the mystical as Islam. That vigilant of faith Ibn Taymiyyah took the next step in prejudicing orthodox Sufism as true Islamic mysticism, and by doing so stigmatizing that which did not convince his intolerance of absolution. My concern with these three figures is that it is with them that Islamic mysticism is constructed and confirmed. My point, therefore, that the classification Islamic mysticism betrays the aspiration to present Islam as having its own tradition of mysticism, as endowed with both orthodoxy and orthopraxy intact. Whereas, on the other hand, such classifications as mystical Islam or Muslim mystic might be seen to point to the ontological state of the phenomenon emerging in relation to the question of being Sufi. Such is the proclivity of Sufi poiesis in works produced by Atta, Rumi, and Ibn Arabi, for example. But even with these I am wary about the degree to which they are able to see through to the end of the metaphysical revolt that they start. The Sufi tradition is therefore invented with one eye shut, the one eye open, the eye of metaphysics. Since Aql was emphasized by the champions of rationalism in the Islamicate, as Christian and Jewish rationalists before them had done, excuse me, in their turn Muslim rationalists too grafted Greek philosophy on Islamic thought. A disastrous enterprise, to say the least, because it resulted in the forced coupling of two disparate worldviews. The Greek Platonic and the Judeo-Christian. It is in this sense that the Abbasid Renaissance can be said to signal decadence in the Islamicate. Decadence here taken to mean, very specifically, the gradual loss of creative imagination and the steady decline of the existential thrust of the Sufi enterprise in the style, mood of the mystical par excellence. The triumph of Ash'arism, itself a rationalized metaphysic contra Mu'tazilism, did not spell the end of Mu'tazilism. Ash'arism was not itself left untouched. Rationalization and reasoning remained at the core of the intellectual and spiritual pursuit of truth, as well as a long-standing dependence upon metaphysical explication as a guarantee of reason. Not unlike the history of Western thought, the history of Islamic intellectuality is also beholden to that Not unlike the history of Western thought, the history of Islamic intellectuality is also beholden to that grand Athenian's theorizing, and to such an extent that the pursuit of understanding has been, as a result of it, kept at a stalemate, neither really moving forward nor going backward in Sufism more broadly, whereas the West, in some ways, moved on. So, what is at stake because of it? It is not difficult to discern that traditional Sufi rhetoric is formulated in the shadow of Greek philosophy, Platonism to be exact. Al-Ghazali is a good example because he was never broadly opposed to philosophy, just philosophy that deviated from Platonism, such as Aristotelianism. It was those protruding aspects of borrowed Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, we might add, including what he held to be the errors of Avicennism in particular. And since Avicenna appropriated the philosophy of Aristotle to make up his own, it was this that Al-Ghazali singled out as heresy among the falasifa. Of the Sufi exotics, like Halajians and Akbarians, it was the unwitting influence of a pseudo-Neoplatonism that singled them out to Muslim scholastics. It was metaphysics, theology, and ratiocinative philosophy, that is to say, the products of logic and the logical mind bequeathed to Islam by Platonism, that underpinned the intellectual structure of Sufi orthodoxy, fashioning out of organized Sufism an intellectual cul-de-sac. I argue, however, that the to ti esti, and the Greek in the audience can correct me, the what it is of Sufism is nevertheless quite the opposite. That is to say that a Sufi, as proclaimed by our notorious poets, was to go within so as to go through Islam, demonstrated in the writings of major figures such as Attar, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Iraqi, Ayn al-Qazat al-Hamadani, Ruzbahan Baqli, and many, many more. These works show that their authors were no doubt aware of the boundary of religion, and though they never go so far as to break it, they are yet never confined by it. Here what I am referring to is Heidegger's complex appreciation of, quote, truth as unconcealing, end quote. In other words, the way that the Sufi is in the Islamic is precisely the way being Sufi unfolds there. Here I allude to Heidegger's thinking about dwelling in assessing that Sufism, in an ontological reading of the mystical in Islam, both is and is not Islamic. These work of poiesis that present such anomalous and analogous glimpses of the possibilities within Sufism were branded heresy by religionists, Sufis among them, because being Sufi was not deemed by the accused as historical but ontological. They presented Sufism as more than ritual and doctrine. One could say the point of Sufism of this kind was to make a hypocrite out of you.